All right, let's dive into Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. We'll be working with excerpts from the book itself, really going to try to untangle these themes of art and beauty and morality and of course, hedonism, that seductive power of pleasure.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating exploration of, well, of the human condition, really.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this book so enduringly popular, right?
I think so.
So, for those who might not be familiar, can you just give us like a quick rundown of the basic premise?
Sure. So imagine this. A young man, Dorian Gray. He has his portrait painted. But here's the twist. As he indulges in a life of pleasure and sin, it's the portrait that ages and reflects the decay of his soul, not him.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty creepy concept.
It is, very much so.
So who are the key players in this story, besides Dorian, of course?
Well, there's Lord Henry Wotton. He's this witty and cynical aristocrat, really embodies this philosophy of hedonism, and he has a profound influence on Dorian, almost like a dark mentor,
Boy.
And then there's Basil Hallward, the artist.
Mm.
He's the one who paints Dorian's portrait in the first place.
Right, and we get the sense that he's genuinely concerned for Dorian, maybe sees something dark lurking beneath the surface.
Definitely. It's like he captures Dorian's beauty on canvas, but also senses the potential for corruption.
That's interesting. So how does Wilde use these characters to sort of explore those big themes we talked about earlier?
Well, take Lord Henry, for example. He's all about pleasure, right?
Hmm.
Believes beauty is superior to intellect, scoffs at morality like it's some kind of joke. You can practically see his words taking root in Dorian's mind and pushing him down this dangerous path.
Yeah, it's almost like he's giving voice to those temptations that maybe we all wrestle with on some level, right?
Exactly.
But let's talk about that portrait because that's where things get really interesting, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
So the portrait doesn't just randomly change, it directly reflects Dorian's actions, like a mirror to his soul almost.
Exactly, like a visual representation of the consequences of his choices.
So for instance, when Dorian callously breaks off his engagement with Sybil Vane, this young actress he becomes infatuated with, the portrait's lips curl into this cruel sneer. It's like the first outward sign that something's gone wrong.
Right, the portrait becomes this physical manifestation of his growing darkness.
And as Dorian continues on this downward spiral, indulging in every kind of excess, the portrait just becomes more and more grotesque, right?
Yeah, it's like watching a slow-motion train wreck.
While Dorian himself remains this picture of youthful beauty.
The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife.
Absolutely. But to me, the portrait is more than just this creepy reflection. It's a symbol of Dorian's conscience, or at least the lack thereof.
Right, it's like this hidden burden he carries.
Exactly. And the fact that he keeps it locked away, hidden from view, it's like he's trying to deny the truth about himself.
He's trying to outrun his own guilt. But that portrait is always there, waiting.
Always lurking in the shadows.
A constant reminder that you can't escape who you really are.
And this brings us to Dorian's relationship with Sybil Vane. I mean, talk about a twisted sense of love and beauty.
Oh, yeah. She's just a pawn in his game.
He's totally infatuated with her, but only because of her acting.
He sees her as the embodiment of these tragic Shakespearean heroines.
But the minute her performance falters, he dumps her without a second thought.
Yeah, he has no interest in the real woman, just the idealized image he's projected onto her.
It's like he's in love with the idea of love, not the actual person.
Exactly. It all goes back to this shallowness, this obsession with surface beauty.
Right. And that's what ultimately leads to some pretty devastating consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Sybil's suicide is a direct result of Dorian's cruelty. And it's just the tip of the iceberg.
So Wilde is really showing us the dark side of this whole hedonistic philosophy, right?
He is, yeah. He doesn't shy away from the destruction it leaves in its wake.
The ripple effect of these selfish choices.
And it's not just Sybil who suffers. Dorian's actions seem to taint everyone and everything he touches.
Like a poison spreading through his social circle.
It's a powerful indictment of this idea that you can live purely for pleasure without any regard for others.
And then things take a really dark turn with that confrontation with Basil.
Oh, yeah, that's where the tension really ratchets up.
Basil is genuinely worried about Dorian, tries to appeal to his conscience to remind him of who he used to be.
But Dorian, he's gone too far down this path of darkness.
He's terrified of being exposed, of having his true self revealed.
And in a moment of sheer panic and rage, he lashes out.
He shows Basil the portrait, this horrifying reflection of his corrupted soul.
And then he does the unthinkable.
He murders Basil.
It's a chilling turning point in the story, Shows just how far Dorian has fallen.
It's like he's crossed a line from which there's no coming back.
Exactly. He's destroyed the one person who truly cared for him, the one person who might have been able to save him from himself.
And that sets the stage for this final, inevitable reckoning.
Yeah, it's all building towards that.
Dorian's fate. The portrait's final transformation. We'll get into all of that next time as we continue our deep dive into the picture of Dorian Gray.
It's going to be a fascinating journey.
But before we move on, I'm curious to hear your initial thoughts. What stands out to you the most about this first part of the story?
Well, for me, it's that portrait, how it serves as this constant reminder of the consequences of Dorian's choices. It's like this haunting visual metaphor.
It really is. And it makes you think about how our actions, they don't just disappear. They leave a mark, not just on ourselves, but on the world around us.
I think that's one of the key takeaways from this book.
And it's something we'll definitely be exploring further as we continue our deep dive. So stay tuned for more insights and analysis of the picture of Dorian Gray.
We'll be right back after a short break. One thing that really struck me when reading those excerpts was how Wilde kind of weaves in his own ideas about art and criticism. Like when he says, to reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. It's almost as if he's suggesting that, real art, it kind of transcends the artist's intentions.
Yeah.
It becomes something bigger than just personal expression.
So you're saying it's like the art takes on a life of its own, which is kind of what happens with that portrait, right? It becomes this separate entity, this reflection of Dorian's soul, but it also kind of shapes his actions.
Yes.
And ultimately seals his fate.
Exactly. And it's interesting, if you think about Wilde's own life, it was full of art. And scandal. I mean, he was this flamboyant figure, known for his wit and his
defiance of social norms.
He was definitely pushing boundaries.
He was. And just like Dorian, he was both praised and condemned for his lifestyle and his artistic expression.
It's hard not to see some parallels there, even though Wilde insisted that there's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book.
Right. He always had that little bit of mischievousness. It makes you wonder if, on some level, he was using Dorian's story to explore those boundaries between art and life, beauty and morality. Like, he's asking, what happens when we put beauty and pleasure above everything else? What's the price we pay for those desires?
And the answer, at least for Dorian, is pretty steep. But I think it's important to consider the role of influence here, too. I mean, Lord Henry, with his charming words and his seductive philosophy, he's almost like the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
Tempting Dorian with that forbidden fruit.
Exactly. He plants those seeds of hedonism, encourages Dorian to embrace his darkest impulses.
Yeah, he's like that little devil on Dorian's shoulder, whispering those tempting thoughts about how fleeting youth and beauty are. And Dorian, he's so young and impressionable, so eager to experience everything, that he falls right under his spell.
It's that classic tale of corruption.
But what I find interesting is that Lord Henry never really seems to face any real consequences for his role in Dorian's downfall.
That's true. He remains this detached observer, almost like he's fascinated by the whole thing.
But he never gets his hands dirty.
It's as if Wilde is saying that ideas themselves can be dangerous.
That they can have this ripple effect, even if the person who originated them remains untouched.
Yeah, makes you think.
It does. So how much responsibility do we have for how we influence others? Is Lord Henry morally culpable for Dorian's actions? Or is Dorian ultimately responsible for his own choices?
That's a tough one. I don't think Wilde gives us easy answers. He presents these flawed characters, caught in this web of their own desires, and leads us to grapple with the moral implications.
But he definitely challenges us to think critically about the nature of influence, how we're all shaped by the people and ideas around us.
Absolutely.
It's like he's saying, be careful who you spend time with and what ideas you let take root in your mind. They might lead you down a path you never intended to go.
A cautionary tale disguised as a Gothic masterpiece.
Exactly. And let's not forget the language.
Oh, yeah. Wilde's use of language is just exquisite.
So rich and evocative.
It's like he paints these vivid pictures with his words, draws you into this world
Yeah.
of beauty and luxury and ultimately darkness.
There are times when the language itself feels like a character in the story.
Absolutely.
Like, remember that description of Dorian's house filled with all these exquisite objects from different cultures and time periods?
Yes.
It's like a museum of his obsessions, this tangible representation of his desire to possess beauty.
It's not just the objects, though, is it? Dorian himself becomes an object of beauty, especially in Lord Henry's eyes.
Right. He's almost like a living work of art.
He becomes this sort of living embodiment of Lord Henry's philosophy. Beauty above all else.
Yeah, and it's almost as if He's trying to create this world where beauty is the only truth that matters. Like, morality doesn't even exist. He surrounds himself with beautiful things, beautiful people, but it's all a facade.
Right, it's this desperate attempt to outrun what's happening inside.
That decay.
Yeah, that growing gap between his outward appearance and his inward state.
Yeah.
That's the real tragedy of the story.
Absolutely. And in some of those excerpts, Dorian gets into all sorts of things. Perfumes, music, jewels, religious vestments. It's like he's desperately trying to find meaning somewhere.
Yeah, trying to reconcile that pursuit of beauty with the weight of his sins.
But what's interesting is that even though he's surrounded by all these people who are supposedly living for pleasure, he ends up completely isolated.
Yeah, even Lord Henry keeps a certain distance.
Like, Dorian's sins become too much to handle.
Even for someone who claims to live beyond conventional morality.
It's like he becomes this warning, this reminder that even in a world that celebrates excess, there are still limits. And then, of course, there's that confrontation with Basil.
That's where the illusion shatters.
He's forced to confront the monster he's become.
And Basil's murder, it's not just another cruel act. It's an act of self-preservation.
He's trying to silence his conscience.
Yeah, get rid of the one person who truly saw him.
And loved him anyway.
And it's heartbreaking because Basil represented a chance for redemption,
He could have helped Dorian confront that darkness.
But Dorian chooses to silence the messenger instead of listening to the message.
Out of fear and pride.
The way Wilde describes that scene, it's chilling. You see how far Dorian has fallen?
It's like murder becomes a solution for him.
And yet, even after all that, he still thinks he can escape.
He tries to destroy the portrait, thinks he can just erase his sins.
But it doesn't work that way. That portrait, it's a manifestation of his soul. Destroying it destroys him.
Because you can't outrun yourself.
Exactly.
So what can we take away from all of this? What is Wilde trying to tell us?
I think he's warning us about the dangers of putting beauty and pleasure above everything else. Living only for the moment.
Without considering the consequences.
Exactly. And he's also reminding us that true beauty is more than just what's on the surface. It's about the choices we make, how we treat others.
The integrity of our souls.
Dorian may have stayed young on the outside, but inside, he was rotting away.
Consumed by that darkness.
So what resonates with you the most?
Yeah.
What part of Dorian's story had the biggest impact?
I think for me, it's that reminder that we can't escape ourselves.
Our choices have
And
consequences.
sometimes the only way to find redemption is to face those consequences. Acknowledge the darkness within us. So what do you think? What does Dorian Gray's story tell you about beauty and morality and the choices we make? Let us know. Until next time, keep diving deep.